All right, hello, welcome everybody. CIS1199. Today we're talking about Chapter 6, gameplay. All right, let's dive right into it. Please save all your questions for the end. Briefly, the table of contents, things we're going to talk about today: rules of play, interactivity modes between the player and elements of your game, a little bit of game theory, a very little bit of game theory, some different types of challenges to the player, and then finally different issues and things to be concerned with regard to balance. Right? So jumping right in again, the rules of play, right? You're making a tabletop game. The players have a list of rules and they're expected to follow them, but they're humans. Maybe they don't follow them. Maybe they cheat. Maybe they forget one of the rules. Maybe they don't understand one of the rules, what have you. If it's a computer game, the computer is responsible for enforcing all of the rules. Anything that is allowed by the computer is going to be, to some players, considered fair game and built-in part of the game. Even things that most players or other players may think is a glitch, some players are going to say, nope, that's part of the game. If you can do it, if it lets you do it, it's fair for anybody to go ahead and try. All right. And that's where we have patches and bug fixes and whatnot, because sometimes those glitches do really affect the balance and the entire gameplay of the game. Somebody's going to be too overpowered or something. So the game, the computer game, is definitely responsible for enforcing all the rules. You can't expect the players to follow the rules on their own if you're not going to enforce them. Next, one of the two rules of play that we're primarily going to talk about is the victory condition. All right, how can the player win the game? Do they actually win the game? Is it a clear win? Is it an open-ended game? Or when they reach the finish line, or when they defeat the other player, is that the end of the game? Clearly defined, either a win condition or an open-ended game. Right? These are things that you have to keep in mind the entirety when you're coming up with the initial gameplay of your game. Is there a victory condition? What is it? How does the player achieve it? And do you properly tell the player how they can achieve it and what exactly the victory condition is? Is there some other way that the player can win that you don't explicitly tell them? Right? Make sure that you do. Tell them everything that they need to know. Right? In addition, is the win condition, is it a single player win, or can a team of players win? And that's another thing to keep in mind. You need to know about it. Players need to know about it. Are they cooperating? Are they not cooperating? Are they kind of cooperating, but can one of them really be the winner? These things should be clearly spelled out for all the players so that they're all on equal footing. The lose condition of the game should be, well, you have one or two options, the implicit or the explicit. Right? Explicitly, like my example says right here, you died, you tell the player they died. An implicit loss is, as I have right here, they simply didn't win. They weren't killed. Maybe they ran out of time. Probably my favorite example is Tetris. There really is no, well, there is a lose condition in Tetris. You can get all the blocks stacked up, but if you're really good, if you're a computer, you're playing Tetris forever. Eventually, you just have to stop playing. So there's two lose conditions in Tetris. Either you explicitly lost because all the things both stacked up, or you implicitly lost because you had to stop playing for one reason or another. You can't just play through your entire life. Moving along interactivity modes. I know we talked about game modes earlier in Chapter 2. These are different than that. They're just a different way of thinking about interactivity modes. These are how the player interacts with different aspects of your game, not just the game itself. So the player is interacting with the game through the game environment. They're navigating the map. There's some spatial awareness in there. There's a HUD that they have to be aware of. They're fully interacting. Anything that they can see through the screen or hear from the speakers, that's the player interacting with the game. And they do that through the platform, the hardware, which is the last one on there, the input devices. They have a controller, some type of a controller, whether it's a keyboard, a mouse, or a handheld, a regular controller. The player is interacting with the controller. That's something that has become second nature to a lot of us gamers. This button does this, that button does that, and we just play the games naturally. We've played hundreds of games in the past, and pretty much all the buttons are the same. But when you're programming that, when you're developing that, you're coming up with an idea for what the X button should do or which button should open up the menu. There's some thought that should go into that. Certainly go with what is become commonplace or what is popular, because that's what the players are going to expect. You don't necessarily want them to have to learn a new control scheme to play your game. However, you may want to change those buttons for something or another. Maybe you don't want the menu button to be the top center button like has been common for years, or maybe you don't want the shoot button to be the trigger. I don't know why you would want that, but you need to think about which buttons do what and when, because not every single screen is going to be available at any given time. You can think of Skyrim. You open up the menu, and there's more than one menu actually in there. There's the journal, there's the map, there's the skill area, there's the equipment area, there's the magic area. You're going through, it's one menu with a bunch of sub-menus. You're going through all this, and they can navigate the menu in a couple of ways, actually. They can use the thumbstick or the D-pad to navigate. Certainly some thought was put into that. And when you're making a game, you should put the same amount of thought into it. Also, we have two players. The player is going to interact with other players. Anytime you have a multiplayer game, the player is interacting with other players, whether it's couch co-op or online co-op or competitive. And this is something that you have to take into consideration, especially with chat enabled. You don't know how players are going to interact with each other. We know they can get pretty vitriol out there sometimes, and that is something to be aware of before you even have that mode. You need to have a plan for what you're going to do for the particularly unfavorable players, we'll say. And there's other ways that players interact with each other. They can go to the wiki pages. They can join in on there. They can put information in there. They can talk on discussion boards, share strategies and cheese methods and everything else about your game. And for a game developer, it's very useful to encourage that type of behavior, because it only adds to the playability and the enjoyability of your game to the players. Players get a lot of information out of that, and they can achieve a lot more in a game than they could otherwise if they're not sharing information with each other. The last one on here that I haven't mentioned yet is a player to the developer. Not too much goes on in there, but if the developers have any kind of activity at all, either on their own website through some sort of discussion board or support ticket, or via Twitter or Reddit or whatever it is. It doesn't have to be the lead developer or any particular person on there, but there are some games who have somebody from the development company monitoring social media, Reddit, Twitter, what have you, and they're seeing what players have to say about updates and changes in the game, and they're relaying that information back to the development team. That's a part of the game. If the developers are listening and players are talking, that information should be used ideally to help continue the life of the game, help continue to make the game better, more enjoyable for all the players. If you're making a game, I definitely encourage you to do that to one degree or another. And moving on to game theory. All right, we're not going to do any kind of math or anything like that. These are just some things to consider about how players interact with each other inside of the game. Okay, so two types that we're going to talk about are zero-sum and non-zero-sum. A zero-sum game means that if a player were to get a new resource, get a piece of resources of any kind, whether it's money or power or weapons or whatever it is, any achievement, any gain from one player is a loss to another player. Right? You're not just interacting with the environment. We didn't just open up a chest and we found some loot in there. All the information is already owned by all the players in the beginning, and one player's gain is another opponent's loss. So the most classic prime example for this is chess. The game starts out, all the things in chess, all the pieces already exist. One player has half, the other player has half, and for any player to make any headway, they have to take away from the other player. It's a zero-sum game. Right? As a result, zero-sum games have to be competitive. It can't be a cooperative chess game. That just doesn't happen. Right? That's the nature of a zero-sum game. There's less zero-sum games as a result, of course, because that's just the nature of how they're made. But this is definitely a main type of game here. Moving to the next is the non-zero-sum game, which means that in order for one player to gain something, that doesn't necessarily mean another player has to lose anything. So like I mentioned before, you're playing a game, you defeated a boss, you came across a chest, there's some loot in it. The loot, when you get the loot, it's not being taken away from the other player, right? It's being taken from the environment. The game provided it to you. And it's not a zero sum, right? +1 and -1 on the other player, that's the zero sum. All right, this is not that. So one player gets something, the other player has no change or a different amount of change or whatever it is. Classic couple of examples are here, the prisoner's dilemma and the tragedy of commons. Right? Normally, we look up the prisoner's dilemma and we talk about it a little bit and get some examples from you. However, as I told you, all the comments saving for the end, right? Joke. So the prisoner's dilemma, I want you to imagine that you and a friend of yours both got busted by the police for committing some crime. They're putting you in different rooms and they want you to snitch on your buddy. And then in the other room, they want your buddy to snitch on you. So you have the option to snitch or not snitch. So does your buddy. You don't know what the other person is going to do, that they don't know what you're going to do. If you both keep quiet, you'll get some kind of punishment, but it's a low punishment. All right. If you tell on your buddy and he keeps quiet, you get no punishment and he gets a lot of punishment, right? The opposite happens. He tells on you and you keep quiet. He gets no punishment. You get a lot of punishment. And then, which doesn't happen too much in the real world, but in games it can. You can both tell on each other, and then that's going to give you both some kind of medium level punishment. So in the end, you have 4 different punishment options. Either you get all the punishment, you get none of the punishment, or you share some portion of the punishment between each other. It doesn't always, when it comes to games, it doesn't always have to be the punishment that you're sharing. The loot chest that can open up. Either you get all of it, the other person gets all of it, or somehow you share that loot. If you're playing with a friend and you can chat with them, either online or next to you, it doesn't matter, it's very easy to come up with some agreement between the two of you. That is not always the case in every game. Sometimes you're playing online. Sometimes there's no chat, or one of the players has chat disabled because some players just don't want to chat because they don't want to hear your mama jokes or whatever. So chat may be disabled for that player. So now the loot box opens up and they can't talk to each other. And what commonly happens is one player grabs all the loot, whoever gets there first. How does that affect your game? Right? Does it matter? Right? Is there a lot of loot so that in the end it kind of balances out? This person grabs the loot really quickly, but then maybe next time the other person grabs the loot really quickly because they happen to be standing closer from the beginning. Does that even out? Is loot really rare? Maybe it creates some sort of unbalance or some sort of animosity between online players where they work together, and then as soon as the boss gets killed, it's a race to go see who can get all the toilet paper from Costco, right? How does that play into your game? Is it something that you want to have in this game? Is it something you want to avoid in your game? Right? That is, you're the developer. That's up to you. Right? But you have to consider it, because if you didn't consider it and you accidentally built it the wrong way, your players are going to have a bad day. And if your players have a bad day, you're going to have a bad day. Next on here, I have the tragedy of commons, which is when players are sharing some sort of common resource. I often think of deck building games where there's usually probably 2 main types of resources, and if one player is hoarding all of one type of resource, what does that do to your game? Does it create some totally uneven level of balance where that player is just the king of everything because they've hoarded this? Or does it fundamentally break your game because now nobody can proceed, nobody can move forward because one player has all of one type of resource and none of the other type of resources, probably, right? They're hoarding all of one, so they can't proceed because they don't have a blending of resources, and nobody else can proceed because they don't have this one that this person's hoarded all of. What does that do to your game? Some games have an unlimited supply of resources. Maybe it's time-based, where resources just keep coming. Some games have a limited number of resources. As soon as the map is generated, there's this much resources in the map, and you've got to get all the resources over time. But what does it do when somebody's hoarding it? So what I like to say, and I have it down here at the bottom, is when you're planning out these resources, how much resources, what types of resources, what can players do to offset the changes? If one player is hoarding one thing, what can the other players do to try and correct that on their own? All right. So I like to think, hey, what if one of my players is an asshole? What things are built into the game to help keep everybody having fun? Right? Does that player eventually get kicked in the butt from karma, or does it ruin the game? Right? So is there some sort of mechanic that you can put in the game that allows the other players to try and help balance it so that the one player who is the asshole doesn't ruin it for everybody else? Right? Okay, moving on to game challenges. All right, there's a bunch of different types of challenges, and we'll start with just kind of defining implicit versus explicit challenge. Starting with explicit, right, those challenges are right in your face. You've told them about it. They've seen it right in there. So we're going to think about Super Mario Brothers. you're walking along and you come across a green pipe and you have to get past the green pipe. You've got to jump across it, jump over it. You come across some bricks, you have to jump over the bricks, and then right after that happens, you come across a hole in the ground. The players jumped over things twice already, and they think, oh, okay, I'm going to jump over the hole in the ground. They're not going to jump into it and think they're going down into another level because you gave them two other things to jump over. They're getting in a group. Third time's the charm. They're going to jump over that thing as well. So you've made these things pretty explicit to them. You've given them visual representation. You just put it right in front of them, told them exactly what it is. Another on here I have is the fetch quest. You've explicitly said, go get this and bring it back to me. Okay. An important aspect of the explicit challenges is, and it doesn't show its face too often, but I like to think of Castlevania type game, Castlevania Symphony of the Night specifically. Can the players overcome a challenge when they get to it? All right. So in Castlevania, you're working your way through the castle. You've got to go to this part of the castle and then backtrack and go to that part of the castle. And you have to get this power up. And then the first power up that you get, you can use to go get the next power up, which you can use to go get the next power up. Did you put all that stuff in the right order? Is if you didn't put all that stuff in the right order, or maybe you put it in the right order, but you didn't realize that there was a third exit to this other room. And if the player happens to choose that before they've gotten the boots of blinding speed or whatever the thing is, before they've gotten the key item, they can get into a place where they can't get back out of, and then they can't continue. Right? So you need to prevent that when you're putting the challenges in. Make sure that they're all in the correct order. Right? Implicit challenges, these are things that are emerged later. These are things like strategy. They become a challenge, but they're not shown to the player right away. You don't teach the player what their strategy is. So things like resource management and prioritization. So a good example that I have for resource management is I play deck building games with my friends sometimes, and it becomes apparent at some point. Usually there's two types of resources, two types of purchasing power, so to speak. Maybe it's attack power versus merchant power. And when you first start playing the game, going play it a couple of times, you try to kind of balance that out because you don't want to limit your options. And then after a while, you realize that if you're balanced, you suck at both things. So then you have to make the choice of which one you're going to go after. And these are implicit, these are emergent challenges. So that you've given the challenge to the player, but they have to really find it on their own. Because anybody can just start playing and they can balance out their attack power versus their merchant power. They can balance those out and they can play the game. And if all the players are doing that, then there's no real challenge. There's no real need for them to learn any new strategy. You don't have to tell them about it. And then when one player stumbles on, hey, I'm going to do all of attack power and none of the other one, and that player totally clobbers all the other ones, then they have just learned a new challenge in your game. They learned it on their own. They figured it out. You didn't tell them. You didn't have to. That's an emergent, implicit challenge. Right? Same thing with prioritization. So think of a real-time strategy game. You have the option to build X amount of units. If you have these resources, if you have resources A, you can build unit B. And if you have resource X, you can build unit Y. Which one do you build first, though? Prioritization. Depending on what type of landmass you're on or who your enemy is, you're going to choose one resource to build before another resource to build. Maybe there's a pretty standard organization. You need to build a blacksmith before you build some units because you want to give them better weapons right away. That's pretty simple. Maybe it's more complex than that. Like Command and Conquer type games, they usually have rock, paper, scissors type units. Which one are you going to build first, right? So the choice is yours. Do you build a whole bunch of, do you do a Zerg rush? Do you build a different type of unit so you can prevent against the Zerg rush? That is an implicit challenge. It does not shown, it's not obvious to the player. They need to learn that through gameplay. All right. And then on the bottom here, I have a note for you, the developer, to think about these implicit challenges and what happens if players use resources in ways that you hadn't really thought about in the beginning. So like the hoarder from my previous example, think about what if the player just hoards one type of resource forever? Does that open up something you didn't think about, and do they become overpowered later on in the game or even early on in the game? Is there an accidental way that you've created to that players can cheese their way through the game? All right, these are things that you have to figure out through gameplay testing. Moving along to perfect and imperfect knowledge. Perfect knowledge is when all the players know all of the things, right? So the classic example is going to be chess again. Every player can see where all the pieces are on the game, not just for themselves, but for their opponent. And there's no amount of game information that either player knows that one player knows and the other player doesn't. Sure, one player may be smarter than the other. That's not actually part of your game, though. There's no game knowledge in chess that one player has over the other player. And imperfect knowledge, like my picture right there when you're playing a NFL game or any other sports game, there's almost a perfect level of knowledge, right? You're going through the menu and you're picking what play you're going to do, but ultimately the other player can't tell exactly which play you're going to do because there's three options right there. And this comes in all the time in games. Most games have some imperfect level of knowledge. You're playing a game and you can't see everything that your opponent has. You can't necessarily see all of their equipment. I think some games you can, and that plays hopefully to the advantage of that game. If it doesn't, maybe it's a mechanic they should remove. This is choices for you to make when you're building it. All right, covered that. Moving on to intrinsic and extrinsic knowledge. Intrinsic knowledge is knowledge that comes directly from your game. You have to tell the player that they can do this. So you're making a game where there's a few different types of magic in your game, and you have to tell your player what those types of magic are and what they do. If it's fire and ice magic, you need to tell the player sometime early in the game what fire and ice magic do. Does fire melt ice? Does ice block fire? One of those things might be true and the other one's not. They can't necessarily take the knowledge that they have from the outside world and apply it to your game. That doesn't always work. Magic in games is a good example of that. Sometimes in some games, fire is a good tool to play against ice, and in some games, the opposite is true. You need to tell your players which is which, and not just that. Any type of knowledge. Think of the Super Mario 1. Before you press start, before you play the game, you see a little example of how to play. Mario walks off to the right, and he jumps on a mushroom, and he jumps up and he hits some coins, and he jumps and he breaks a brick, and a mushroom comes out, and he gets the mushrooms, and he becomes big. They basically told you everything you need to know about playing that game in all of 10 seconds before you even did anything. While you were thinking, should I press start? The game showed you pretty much everything you need to know. That's all the intrinsic knowledge, right? Extrinsic knowledge, things that are external to your game. So if your game has mechanics that follow real world rules or follow rules that have become popular and mainstream with many other games, that's considered extrinsic knowledge. You don't necessarily have to tell your players every little detail about this. You can just assume that they'll figure it out. Right? That comes with a caveat. I have a strong warning to you about extrinsic knowledge. Right? Do not assume that your player knows something. Right? Everybody comes from all different walks of life. They've all played a different history of games than you or I have, and they may not know something that is second nature to you, and you can't always assume that they do, because if you do, they'll play the game for 10-20 minutes and they'll get to this thing that you thought was obvious, but they just had never seen it before, and that becomes an unpassable boundary for them, or they've got to Google it, or they just quit. So one way or another, let everybody know. Don't assume that they know these things. That almost says maybe everything should be intrinsic, but it doesn't have to be. Just don't assume that things that are absolutely necessary to know in your game are going to be known by everybody. All right. And next, spatial awareness. How does the player move along through your game world? How do they get from point A to point B? How much do you want to help them in that? Is it a maze game? Do they have to figure out it on their own? Does your game have... do you even want to have navigation as an obstacle for your player to overcome? Right? Some games do. I have an example of Fallout up here. Walking around is an immersive part of that game. If they told you where everything was and they make it pretty simple, but still they give you a 2D map of the tunnels and a 2D map of the environment overhead. You get a bit of a compass, but you still have to navigate through tunnels and maybe around mountains or whatnot. Maybe there's some impassable path or whatnot, and that's how they immerse the players into the game. You have to make these considerations for your own game. To some extent, you can just do what's been done before, of course, but make sure that players are not just getting lost in your game and not having any fun. If you have one area in your game where players get lost, hopefully that's an area where they're going on purpose. Maybe there's some really awesome tool or power-up of some kind in that one area that's difficult. If there's nothing of use for the players in that difficult to navigate place, they're just not going to go in there. And you're going to have built something that no one is going to play with. So keep this to a minimum. You don't want to get players lost. They're going to enjoy it. Players aren't enjoying it. They're not going to play your game. Right? I think I said that a few times on all these things. All right, moving on. Pattern recognition and matching as a game challenge. Right? There's not too much to talk about these. We're pretty familiar with puzzle games, Tetris, 3 in a row type games. One note that I have for this is try and make bright colors or easily identifiable things. If you have 2 items in your puzzle that look similar, that the player has to stop and think about, they're not going to move quite as quickly, and the choice is not going to be quite as automatically apparent to them. They're going to have to stop and think about it. You can use that to your advantage. Maybe you want the players to slow down a little bit. Most of the time we don't, but that is something to think about, just the ease of somebody visually making this choice almost automatically once they've been playing the game for a while. Moving on. Resource management, we've talked about a few times. but we haven't talked about it as a type of challenge. So resource management with no challenge is Santa's backpack, right? You just let the players have as much as possible. They can have every item in the game, an infinite amount of every item, or 99 or 999, whatever it is. They don't have to do any resource management at all. There's a fair number of games that do their resource management in that way, and that's because that's not one of the challenges that is a goal for that game. You get your challenges elsewhere, and they decided, let's not make resource management one of our challenges. Plenty of other games want resource management to be a challenge. So my example right here, you think that a first-person shooter game doesn't have resource management. Well, it does, because you have a limited number of backpack space. In the screen right here, you can only have 12 items being carried. So if there's, 3 or 4 different elemental weapons to choose from, and there's a handful of other different weapon types with their different abilities, sniper rifles, pistols, rocket launchers, machine guns, that kind of thing, the player just simply can't have one of each combination. They have got to choose what their favorite is. And luckily for that game, usually players limit themselves to only 2 or so different weapon types, depending on what character they choose. So that limits the amount that they're going to need, but they're still going to want a weapon of every element. Still with 12, they can't do that. They can unlock it later on in the game. They can get more as they play the game more. They'll need more equipment. So it's a good way to get them focused on it early on in the game. They have a smaller limit, and then the limit gets larger as they need it. There's other resource management challenges, player encumbrance. We've all played Skyrim, I'm sure. Players can also only have so much, and city building things, any other strategy games where you're building things. Players have to manage their resources to build cities and whatnot. So they have lumber or concrete or water or whatever the case is. Different buildings take different amounts of materials, and they have to manage, okay, I'm going to build a whole bunch of power plants, and they require a lot of metal but not that much wood, so I'm going to less focus on wood and now focus on something else. And these are all challenges to the player, right? They need to be monitored. You need to make sure that your game has everything that it needs. And maybe the resource management is a key challenge to your player. Maybe it's a secondary or even a tertiary challenge to your player. Maybe the some other aspect of your game is the real challenge. So you want to make the resource management a little easier for your players, right? And that's how you're going to balance this challenge out. And the last challenge that I have in here is reaction time. So things like button combinations for power moves, or jumping and dodging, attacking and blocking, sneaking. I have smooth moves in there where you're just trying to respond really quickly to visual cues on the game. Not every game is going to have a whole lot of reaction time challenges, and if your game doesn't have a lot of reaction time challenges, and then all of a sudden you get to level 12 and now there's a whole bunch of reaction time challenges, or a whole bunch of one type of reaction time challenge, it's really going to throw the players off. They thought that wasn't one of the challenges that they had, and then all of a sudden it is. It's something that you can't just throw at players and surprise them with. They're playing a Street Fighter type game like I have here. They're aware of it right from the beginning. They know that's a key challenge of the game. If they're playing a Fallout game, the reaction time is how quickly can you open vats, and then things slow down a little bit. They're not just shooting really quickly, although they could if they wanted to shoot without VATS. So this is just the last type of challenge to talk about here. Moving on to balance of some of these challenges and other things that we've talked about, or how we're going to balance all of this. Normally I have this little video that I show everybody that talks specifically about Dark Souls 2 and how that game is balanced. Please pause the video and go watch that now if you like. It's done by the folks at Extra Credits. It's everything that they do is pretty well done. So pause this, open up another tab, and go watch that, and then come back. I'll wait. Are you back? Okay. So how are you going to balance games is not just thing for multiplayer, right? You're not only balancing the game for a multiple of players, you have to balance it for single players as well. Like Dark Souls, it's not strictly a single player game, but for a lot of people it is. The multiplayer aspect of Dark Souls is not for everybody, and the game is very well balanced, and hopefully your games are very well balanced as well. All right. Let's go to some classic game balance first. I have the Three Little Pigs example and the rock, paper, scissors example. Hopefully these are very self-explanatory. The Three Little Pigs type of difficulty progression or equipment or unit progression is you start off with something weak and then you get something stronger and stronger and stronger. The difficulty from a developer standpoint and how to balance this is when do they get upgrades, how frequently do they get upgrades, are the characters getting upgrades at the same pace as the enemies, are they getting upgrades the same pace as other players. These are the difficulties as a developer that you have to kind of balance out with the Three Little Pigs type. You don't want the sorcerer character to be stuck in the hay house for so much longer than everybody else that it becomes near impossible to actually play that character. But you want to balance that out a little bit. Maybe that sorcerer character does stay in that hay house level of equipment for quite a while, but then they move on to the wood house for a short period of time, and they get to the brick house faster than everybody else. So they're difficult up front, but then they're really powerful sooner than the other players are. So they have a really short mid-range level. They power through that pretty quickly. So that's one way to offer the players early challenge with a reward later on. That's one way of thinking about it. There are certainly many other ways that you can balance this out. That's just one. Moving on to the rock, paper, scissors. Command and Conquer, or other real-time strategy, are very famous for this, where they have 3 unit types that one unit type is weak against one of the other ones, but strong against one of the other ones. And that happens with all of the 3 main unit types. So that as you're progressing through the game, you kind of have to take into account the game environment and the opponents and pick 1 or possibly 2 of the rock, paper, scissors attributes to focus on, or gear or equipment or units, whatever the case is. One of them is not necessarily always strong or always weak. It's good in some situations and bad in others. This can be elemental. Maybe a fire weapon is really good when you're fighting against earth weapons. Like fire is really good against wood, but then somebody else comes along with water magic and destroys you. That's another example of rock, paper, scissors. You can use that, and players will love the ability that they can be powerful in one scenario without necessarily just being always overpowered. They can't just get, oh, I'm going to get the fire weapon and then I'm always going to be awesome, and then they get bored. So they get the fire weapon in a rock, paper, scissors game, and they're great for a while until they get to the water level, and now they have to build themselves up again. Now they're presented with this balancing act where it was cool, it was easy for a while, and now it's hard again, and then I'm going to get another, I'm going to get a earth weapon, I'm going to get a wood weapon when I get to the water level, and then it's going to get easy again, and then I'll get to the fire level, and now I have to go and get a water weapon. So you're continually forcing them to change and adapt and balance them out. All right. Okay, moving to trade-offs, which I'd like to use the racing game example right here with top speed, acceleration, and handling. It's very similar to the rock, paper, scissors, where sometimes you want good acceleration, sometimes you want handling, sometimes you want top speed, and one is not necessarily better than the other. Maybe you have an advantage in some levels versus others given either top speed, acceleration, or handling, or maybe it just fits your play style. Maybe two players who race a little bit differently. Maybe one of them is they hit the brakes more often than the other person, or one of them turns more wildly than the other person, and so they're going to want to put emphasis on one of these attributes more than the others, and neither of them is necessarily stronger or weaker than any of the other ones. It's a personal preference. This allows your players to choose for themselves what they want to focus on, regardless of what level of the game they're on, or regardless of what the other players are doing. This is a way for them to self-balance, or a way for you to enforce the balance if you wanted to force one of these things to happen. Not sure why you would offhand, but the option is there. All right, next, combinations of things in your game. So as players are finding new gear, they're building, they're crafting new gear, they're building things. They are probably, if 1 million people play your game, they're going to play it 1 million different ways, and 999,000 of those are going to be different than what you had in mind. So a balance issue that you need to be aware of to worry about is, can players pick certain combinations of things that create a problem in balance? So I've got an older example in here, Command & Conquer Generals, back in the early 2000s, where you could build, if you picked the Americans to play as, you could build a Humvee. Humvees normally come with machine guns mounted on them. You could put one sniper in the back and put 3 rocket launcher guys also in the back. So the Humvee could carry 4 units, 4 foot soldiers. And you put those 4 things in there. The one sniper, so he's really good at shooting other foot units. The 3 Rocketeers are really good at attacking heavy armored stuff, and then the Humvee is the middle between that, the third thing in the rock, paper, scissors. And Humvees are also really fast. In Command & Conquer, you can actually put all 3 of those things together and create essentially one unit that is pretty near to being invincible. And you could just build a whole bunch of these. You put 8 of these things together, you can send them all the way across the map, destroy the entire enemy area, and not have to worry about anything. And this is only an option if you were to pick the Americans, because they're the only ones that have the Humvee. If you picked either China or the Middle Eastern unnamed country, I think it is in that game, if you pick that one, you don't get that option. So the Americans in this game are totally overpowered once you figured out this somewhat unique combination of units. So this is something to try out, something to be aware of when you have a whole bunch of elements in your game that work together. If players put them together in unexpected combinations, what's going to happen in there? So another more general example I have down here is players are always these days, they're always min-maxing. You find a lot of glass cannon units. For those of you unfamiliar, the glass cannon is when somebody makes a character that is really, really offensively powerful, but they will probably die if they take a single hit or a couple of hits. So they're super powerful. They're a cannon, but they're incredibly weak on their own. So they'll need to be protected somehow, or they'll just need to go full out on the offense, and hopefully they never take a hit. That the glass cannon aspect generally solves itself because if the players take a hit, then they're destroyed, then they're killed, whatever the case is. If it's multiplayer, then you can have the opposite of the glass cannon. You can have the tank in front of the glass cannon, and that makes a pretty lethal combination. But more than likely, if your game lets players play as a tank and a glass cannon, you've probably already thought of that. Min-maxing works to a little bit more of an extent. There's a lot of min-maxing going on in games like Dark Souls, although the folks from Software did an excellent job, and you can min-max Dark Souls to your heart's content, and you're never going to break the game. They've done a great job with that, and hopefully in your game you have thought about that as well, and it's not quite so easy for somebody to become overpowered. Next type of static balance in here is feedback. This is feedback to the player. As the player advances so much, you're providing constant feedback. So my classic example I have here is the blue shell from Mario. When you're in first place, you pretty much only are allowed to get banana peels and green shells, like the two worst types of offensive weapons. And then when you're in last place, you can get all the awesome types of weapons. And also when you're in first place, of course, the blue shell is the thing that's targeting you specifically. And this is to try and force the players to be balanced. And it gives you, it actually gives the first place player a little bit less to think about. When they're in first place, there's nobody in front of them. They're just trying to go fast, and they don't have a lot of options in their weapons that they get, or their power-ups, whatever you want to call them. And it makes it a little bit streamlined for them. And then the players that are in the back, they have all these overpowered or more types of tools in their kit that they're able to use, and it gives them more fun. Maybe they're allowed to maybe they can use it in order to get to first place briefly right before the finish line. But in any case, it forces a level of balance. Without things like this, Mario Kart would not be a fun game. It would definitely not be as popular as it is. It would just be a plain old racing game. We would most likely consider it to be a kiddie game, and no grown players would like it too much outside of the cartoon aspect of it, right? Without these power-ups, without the balance that's in the power-ups, Mario Kart would not be Mario Kart. Next, dynamic balance. Just talk briefly on dynamic balance. This is how the players themselves are going to interact with the balance of the game. So can they destroy some of the resources? Can they destroy any aspect of the game? Can they destroy a bridge? Can they destroy anything? So that is, or do they have to destroy things in order to either maintain balance or to unbalance things on purpose, right? So that's an option to them. The other is maintenance, which is kind of the opposite of destruction. Can players fix things, build things, put them together in order to either add more balance to the game or to offset the destruction that they or some of the other players have done. And then restorative is kind of difficult to take away from maintenance. Maintenance and restoration are pretty similar, but this is fixing the unbalance in the game, fixing the chaos, and that. And maintenance is more a little bit about building things, not necessarily fixing the unbalance. So some games are going to let the players do all three of these, and maybe they're going to focus on, maybe they have different tasks for different levels, and your task on this level is focused on one of these things more than the others, and then every level you're going to change this up a little bit. That's the dynamic balance when the players take the active role in the balance instead of the developers building it into the game. Okay. And my last slide, we made it all the way to the end, is the economic balances. These are real, like the balancing of resources, which we talked about a number of times in here. Encumbrance balance, things like that. I like to mention the Carney trick. For those of you unfamiliar, the Carney trick, when you go to a carnival and you're buying tickets to ride the rides at the carnival, for $10 you can buy 7 tickets, and the rides cost 3 tickets. So you go, you buy 7 tickets or 8 tickets, whatever, you buy 7 tickets, and you go on 2 rides for 3 tickets each, and you have 1 ticket left over. And it makes people go, oh, I have 1 ticket left over. I'm going to go buy some more tickets because I don't want this one to go to waste. So they go spend $10, buy 7 more tickets. Now they have 8. They go on 2 more rides. They have 2 tickets left over. And they say, okay, well, I guess I'm going to go buy some more tickets so I don't waste these 2, because I did it the first time when I only had 1. Now I have 2 tickets left over, and I better not waste 2. So they go buy $10 more in tickets. Now they have 9 tickets. They go on 3 rides. They run out of tickets, and that's when they say, okay, time for me to go get some lunch, or whatever the case is. Time for me to leave. Only when they finished. So when you're talking about economics and resources in the game, that's often done. Let's say you're doing some sort of RTS game again. You got characters going and chopping wood for lumber. Every time they bring some lumber back, they bring back 70 lumber from the trees, right? And when you go to build, they pretty much only work in 50s and 100s. Right? So there's always a little bit left over. You can pretty quickly, almost entirely avoid from getting all the way down to 0. You always have a little bit. And that doesn't make the players come back for more like it does with the Carney trick, but it makes the players feel like, okay, I'm almost there. I'm not at 0. I've got, I can just get a little bit more. I can get a little bit more. And then when they have 210 lumber and they want to build something for 200, they think, okay, it's almost all of my almost all of my resources, but it's not quite all of my resources. So they feel more at ease with making that decision. It's less of a difficult decision because it's never, or almost never, 100% of their resources. I'm sure you've played a game and you've got to some place where you're going to purchase something with the in-game currency, and you thought, oh, this is a hard decision because it's all of my resources. So a way you can balance that is you can try to make it not all of their resources as often as possible. And one way to do that, if it's an RTS type of building resources, is to use the Carney trick with your numbers. So they get their resources in one amount and they spend them in a different multiple of amounts, right? And then they're less likely to do 100% change over. All right. All right, and that's it. All right, we got through all 26 slides. Does anybody have any questions? Yeah, how about you in the back? Yes, we're done. All right. Enjoy the rest of your day, and check on Blackboard for any discussion board that's posted. All right. I'm pretty sure that there's a quiz for today. Do the quiz. I am going to unlock the quiz so you don't have to do it in the 3-hour period during class that I normally have for you. So just get that done anytime this week. All right, that's what I'm going to unlock it for Monday through Friday. Okay, and keep working on your projects. Just turn those in via Blackboard. You don't have to do a presentation, I guess, because how could you, unless you're doing YouTube like I am. But don't do that. Just turn it in. So still do the document and the PowerPoint, and I will just grade it. I'll pretend that you presented the PowerPoint. Just put the information on the slides that you were going to do anyway, and turn that in. All right. So discussion board, quiz, and project for the week. Carry on. All right. See you here next week for Chapter 7.